Often, when we start learning to draw, the focus of line work is, well, it's drawing lines. And we think of lines as being the key ways of creating our drawing, the scene, the objects, whatever we want. And so there's an emphasis on outlining, and we've often focused very much on things such as getting the shapes right, getting the proportions correct, and getting the perspective. The problem is that our focus is often so intently on these things that we neglect all the other ways that our ink line work can have an impact on how our drawing looks. I'm going to quickly run through 10 different ways we can use our line work besides what I've just said and besides what we're seeing here. And this is the difference between going beyond beginner stage and starting to create drawings that exploit all the wonderful possibilities of mark making to create effects that go way beyond what we're aiming for. Here we have a drawing from a few years ago that I've just discovered again. I'd actually forgotten I'd done this, but it's a great example, this scene of the chapel of the Palace of Versailles, that we can use our line work to focus attention, to create a focal point. So here we're looking under the balcony that the royal family would sit on to attend Mass, well away from the crowds down here. But by controlling my line work to have heavier, darker form here, firstly, that gives us a sense of being crowded down under here. And then I've done more detail and darker line work here. So this draws the eyes past these galleries here. So by having a darker, heavier effect here that funnels our attention, by drawing the detail up here, even though it's actually much further away than this detail here, by drawing it in more detail and with heavier ink effect, we draw the eye very quickly past here to the focal point. And we have to have this in mind before we start, because otherwise we will start drawing on this side or down here with too much weight, with too much ink, with too much detail before we realize what we've done and what we now can't create in our drawing. Successful line work really depends on having a plan for how our drawing's going to look, what effect overall we're wanting to create, in this case, this focal point, and then working out structurally how we need to put on our line work to get that end result. The second thing we can do with our line work is to create illusion, to create the feeling that things are there that actually aren't there. So here we have these wonderful fanned patterned cobblestones on the streets of Paris on top of Montmartre in this instance. But if we were to try and draw them all, besides the fact it would basically be impossible to do it so it looked accurate, we'd also have so much black here that it would totally overwhelm, take the attention, be darker than the focal point we have up here. So instead we've controlled our line work to create the illusion that we're looking at these and that they continue all the way up to the gutter without actually having to draw very many at all. My playlist, Drawing the Effect of Detail, is really all about creating this sort of illusion with our ink marks. This next one is that we can actually create lines without drawing lines. By controlling our marks, we can actually create what we might have been tempted to do with a line. And so, for instance, let's take the edges of this dirt roadway. We might have been tempted just to go a line and a line, because in some ways that would have told the story that was in the reference. And equally, where there are ruts here and here, we might have just put lines here to indicate the ruts. Maybe we would have done them a little more heavily, closer. But instead, by controlling our line work much more and by using other options, we've created a far more realistic feel for the edges of the dirt road and the ruts that have appeared in it. This next one is quite ironic. With our black ink, we can actually draw light. We can draw something that in itself has no form, has no shape, has no outline. And yet by carefully controlling the marks we put on the paper, we can create something that we could never outline. And in doing so, we can create very dramatic, very lifelike effects that go way beyond anything we could even begin to imagine when we're still thinking this way about what line work is and how we use it in drawing. And we can start to strategize ways to create light effects and use them in whichever way creates the scene that we want. This one I think is probably one of the most obvious, but I still end up looking at lots of drawings and feeling that it's not being used nearly the way it should be used, and certainly not to the degree it could be used, and that's to use our line work to create contrast. So we have this nice little memorial structure here in a park in Tasmania. On its own, because of its simplicity, it could really get quite lost. But by using our line work to accentuate the dark value of the foliage that sits behind it, we make the forms that we have in some ways outlined really stand out, really pops this forward and gives us a sense of depth. But more than that, visually creates a very dramatic backdrop for what could have been a fairly plain subject. What we've done is we've made a feature of the plainness by the way we've controlled our line work. One of the biggest problems I see in drawings of outdoor scenes is the treatment of the groundwork. We usually have ground that just doesn't look like it's sitting flat, and the reason is we have not controlled our line work carefully enough to allow for foreshortening of the ground. The fact that as the ground moves further away, the distances narrow more and more. So what may be quite visible, such as this grass here, a small distance back, only some very small marks are needed to create the same size grass. And we go back a little bit more and almost any marks at all are going to be too big if they're going to suggest blades of grass as our marks down here have. We can't use the same marks to describe things further back that we've used to describe things down here if in life we couldn't see individual blades of grass further back. We've got to control our marks and the closeness of them and what they are to create what we see, or more importantly, what we don't see in real life. Grass, the ground area, an incredibly neglected part because we're focused on outlining the shapes of the things on the ground, and we don't realize that we need to put the same effort into every part of our scene. Controlling our line work, we can actually create the sense of curved, worn edges that we don't get if we just draw a line going across. Controlling our line work to create edges is incredibly important in a large range of natural subjects particularly. Notice up here with this foliage in the background, there is no outline for the top of these distant tree canopies. Instead, the vertical lines for the value, for the darkness of the hatching, creates an edge, a very soft, visually gentle edge, which is how this appears in life, that far better captures the reality that we're looking at than if we'd done an outline of the sort beginners are so often tempted to do without thinking. Bit of an unusual subject here for my next example, but that's that we can use our line work not to outline shape, but to create form. And by form, I mean the three-dimensionality of it. The shape is something we could cut out as a silhouette, but the form is a sense of the three dimensions of a horizontal and of a plane coming off it at an angle, and of the tassel coming off it at another angle. With this cushion, there's a roundedness in the plumpness of the cushion. There's some distortion in the plane of that roundness up the top. And those puckers are also created by our line work. It's not just outline. And just because it's here, notice this line here is a lot lighter and it doesn't even join up than these other closer outlines. Even on a silhouette, we're not necessarily outlining with a line. We want to create the sense that this arm of the chair is further away than here, and that it's actually got light striking it, which creates visually a different feel to what we see down here. Before we move on from form, we can see with these rocks here, my line work has created the sense of roundedness of the rocks and of the jaggedness and the different ways it's weathered or broken. But a better example for this point is to look at these steps, and that's to consider controlling our line work to create edges, and particularly when the edges are not sharp. These old stone blocks are weathered and they've been walked on and curved, and so by controlling our line work we can actually create the sense of curved, worn edges that we don't get if we just draw a line going across. Controlling our line work to create edges is incredibly important in a large range of natural subjects particularly. Notice up here with this foliage in the background, there is no outline for the top of these distant tree canopies. Instead, the vertical lines for the value for the darkness of the hatching creates an edge, a very soft, visually gentle edge, which is how this appears in life, that far better captures the reality that we're looking at than if we'd done an outline of the sort beginners are so often tempted to do without thinking. This next example is about creating the effect of detail. And so with the sandstone of this old church, again, by careful use of my line work, I've got a far more realistic effect from not drawing all of the stones than if I had drawn all the stones, in which case the ink for the stonework would have stood out more than the actual overall shape of the church. I've done something similar here with the foliage in the garden. But this building also illustrates something of my next point, which is that we can create a sense of distance by controlling our line work. So with heavier lines here, drawn slightly more slowly, with slightly more detail, with slightly darker values being created than what's up here with this furthest part of the church, creates a very strong sense that this is further away than here. Whereas if we don't do this, while the perspective tells us that this is further away from here, we recognize the shaping, visually it all looks very flat, it all looks very on the same plane. Here, this church feels like it's moving further away because of the marks that we've used. And so another example of this final point, by controlling our marks, we can create the sense of distance. And here we have a similar thing. The perspective tells us that this is moving away from us. This beautifully carved balustrade of the National Gallery in Berlin, this wonderful pattern. If you look here at my line work, the lines are quite heavy and in many places overdrawn to capture shadows and the three-dimensionality of the detail we have here. But as we move up, they become lighter and fainter. And in fact, unfortunately, the camera is working hard to exaggerate the darkness up here, because in life it is much lighter up here than down here. And perhaps you can see something more of that just with these straight lines where they go from quite dark to lighter, and the same here from dark to lighter. We don't just create a sense of distance through what the perspective tells us. We create the feel of distance by controlling our marks. Just because you're at the beginner stage doesn't mean you have to stay focused on these very limited areas. There's no reason why you can't start thinking right from the start of your drawing discovery of all the ways we can use our ink lines and marks to create far more realistic effects. G'day, I'm Stephen Travis. Hope you found this enlightening. Hope some of these areas perhaps are new ones that you can try. in your drawing. And, well, I wish you all the best. But in the end, remember, whatever you do, however it looks, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.